Well, hello everybody. Can you hear me in the back all right? Great. My name is Scott Bates. I'm president here at the Center for National Policy, and on behalf of our chairman, Peter Kovler, thank you for coming here today. From Indonesia to Iran and from Kurdistan to Caracas, the state-owned energy companies of the People's Republic of China are on a buying spree, leveraging their trillion-dollar trade surplus to gain control over energy resources on a global scale. The reasons for this economic power play are clear. China's domestic energy production has been relatively static, while its demand has skyrocketed in the past decade. China is a world leader requiring energy to run its booming economy, and it needs it now. The future growth of China's economy relies on securing global energy resources, and the political future of the Chinese Communist Party is tied to continued economic success in China. Therefore, securing global energy resources is the highest political priority of the Chinese leadership. What does this mean for Western energy companies who must compete with state-owned enterprises of the PRC and to our own access to global energy supplies in the decades ahead? And if there is a truism to strategic competition and military conflict in recent years, it is that major powers will act to protect their access to energy supplies. So what does that mean for strategic competition in the South China Sea, the West Philippine Sea, if you will, the Taiwan Straits, and all of Southeast Asia? To help us discuss these very important issues, we have some experts who have dedicated many years to understanding these very issues. Steve Levine, to my left, is a contributing editor at Foreign Policy, a fellow at the New America Foundation, and author of The Oil and the Glory, a history of oil told through the 1990s and 2000s oil rush in the Caspian Sea. Do you have copies with you? Maybe at the table in the back, but it's available on the internet. He's also an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where he teaches energy security in the Security Studies program. Mr. Levine is also author of Putin's Labyrinth, a profile of Russia through the lives and deaths of 6 Russians, and is a former chief foreign affairs writer for Business Week and Central Asia Caucasus correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. He previously covered the same region for the New York Times and Newsweek, and from 1988 to 91 he was Pakistan-Afghanistan correspondent for Newsweek. From 85 to 88, he was Manila correspondent for Newsday, so welcome and glad to have you here. Charles Ebinger, over here to my right, is director of the Energy Security Initiative and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He has more than 35 years of experience specializing in international and domestic energy markets, oil, gas, coal, and nuclear, and the geopolitics of energy, with a particular focus on the Middle East, South Asia, Central Asia, Africa, the Arctic, and Antarctic. That's about everywhere, I think.
Not so strong a lamp.
Okay, you're humble. Ebinger has served as an energy policy advisor to over 50 governments on restructuring their state-owned energy sectors, privatization, and creation of regulatory regimes. He's an adjunct professor of electricity economics at Johns Hopkins and is one of the Nuclear Energy Institute's nuclear energy experts. And to my far left here is Carter Page. He's our senior fellow for energy here at the Center for National Policy. Carter is founder and managing partner of Global Energy Capital, LLC, a New York-based financial institution and investment fund focused on energy investments worldwide. In his work as both an advisor and a direct investor, he has participated in over $25 billion in strategic mergers and acquisitions and financing transactions across the diverse segments of the energy and power sector. Carter is the former COO of the Energy and Power Investment Banking Group at Merrill Lynch, and until 2007 was deputy branch manager of Merrill Lynch's office in Moscow, which he opened in 2004. Carter's a member of CFR, and was co-director of the study group on energy development in the Caspian Sea. He's an adjunct associate professor at New York University and a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy as well. So that's the lineup today. We have a lot of great presentations, but in addition to that, the way we like to work it here at CNP is that there'll be a lot of time for you to get in the conversation, offer your thoughts and your questions as well. So I believe the order of the draw was Charles. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out today. China is a fascinating place to me because when I started my career in the U.S. government shortly after the first oil shock, it's hard to remember that China was a significant oil exporter in the world of nearly 3 million barrels a day. Whereas today we see the country consuming, I think in 2010, roughly 9.2 thereabouts million barrels a day, of which only about 4.8 of that was from domestic consumption. So we see a country certainly on the move in the oil sector. We see a country that in the last 2 years, according to the Energy Information Administration and the International Energy Agency in Paris, has accounted for about 40% of the growth in world oil demand and is likely to continue on a significant track, albeit at a slightly lower level. But while we're here today to talk about oil, I think just to put it in context, for those of you that may not follow China's energy scene in total, it's important to remember that still China gets over 70% of its energy from coal. And even though they have prodigious and should be applauded for their efforts to reduce their use of coal, most forecasts suggest that coal will continue to be a dominant fuel of roughly 60% even by 2035. And when you see sounds like, well, but that's actually a total increase in coal consumption, even though in percentage terms it's dropping dramatically. So in terms of anybody worried about climate change, it's clear to me that unless carbon capture and sequestration can be proven to be both commercially and technically feasible, we will remain on a collision course with China in terms of their climate change policy. In the oil sector, we're seeing only about 19% of total energy consumption coming from oil, but that belies the fact that, of course, the oil is particularly important in the fast-growing transportation sector, which any of you who have spent time in China realize every time you go back a few months from your previous trip, the congestion is getting worse and worse and worse. And China is beginning to look at things like congestion taxes and other efforts to limit the volume of traffic in their cities. And we also hear a lot about, in the news recently about the case of China dumping solar panels into the United States market, international trade cases. From what you would read in the trade press, you would think that China's renewable energy industry is dominating the world, but it's quite interesting when you actually look and see that the contribution of solar and wind power in the Chinese energy mix is less than 0.1% today. This is a country that is going to remain dependent on coal, on oil, and natural gas, which China is looking for around the world as well as oil. China is looking at massive importation of LNG. There's the prospects of what some people in USGS and others believe are absolutely prodigious shale gas resources, predominantly in the western part of the country. But they're 1,275 TCF, I believe, is the high number of potential shale reserves. But there again, it's going to be incredibly important in the future of world gas trade if China has that gas and is able to develop it. Because if you look right now at the claims that looks like China will have on the world LNG market, it's absolutely staggering. And if we could get China to have its own domestic gas and reduce its need for LNG, that would free up the gas market for other countries in pressing need of it, such as India, Vietnam, and other countries throughout the Pacific Basin. China has indeed, as Scott said, had a prodigious effort to look for equity oil deals around the world. I think by last count, it was just under 30 different countries that China had some kind of equity deals with, the various state-owned energy companies of China. But I'll play the devil's advocate here and argue that I don't think there's a shred of evidence to suggest that anyone that has an equity deal has ever been insulated from the petroleum shocks in the world. And I'm thinking particularly back after the 73-74 crisis when the European states and Japan rushed out so-called Euro-Arab dialogue trade agreements, big industrial facilities financed by Europe and Japan throughout the Gulf countries. And yet, when 1979's oil price crisis came, it didn't get them any special deals. And I think what you will see is that any country, particularly poor countries in Africa where China is very aggressive, it will be hard pressed for a Sudan or a Congo if the price of oil were to be disrupted and go to ever higher levels to let oil flow out of the country to China or India that has pursued similar tasks. But nonetheless, the Chinese, for whatever reason, better or worse, believe that this is a way to procure oil. They are tremendously aggressive in their marketing. Pick one country in particular that I know well because I did my dissertation there years ago, Angola. Angola is now one of the largest single producers to China. China is also, of course, throughout Africa, often linking oil deals with mineral development because they're equally concerned about access to critical strategic materials that they'll need for their further industrial development. China will, I will argue, become increasingly aggressive over the next few years as a vendor of international nuclear reactors. I don't think the world has gotten ready for this yet, but realizing that they are going to become a major exporting country at the same time that their projections for indigenous nuclear development are quite substantial. And while one can laugh at how high the numbers are for the growth in nuclear power, I never laugh when the Chinese say they're going to do something, because 95% of the time they do it. China has also been very aggressive in hydroelectric development, not only in China, but also in its immediate neighbors, trying, particularly in Myanmar, although that's now generated some political backlash about the country being taken over by Chinese influence. And with the liberalization of Myanmar, I think you'll see more international actors go there. They have, of course, had a very aggressive campaign to build oil and natural gas pipelines to Central Asia, some of the longest distance pipelines in the world, to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. So when the Chinese say they can build long distance pipelines, take them at their word. There's also ongoing negotiations with the Russians to move Russian energy from the Far East, particularly natural gas, into China. But those have been off and on again because the Russians insist on linking the price of gas to the pattern of their existing contracts in Europe, which index the price of natural gas to oil. And the Chinese have said, no, we should get a better deal on that. So that those have remained somewhat behind what people had originally hoped. China has been a very aggressive area that I specialize in, particularly South Asia, has been extremely aggressive in Pakistan, particularly helping the Pakistanis both to build large-scale hydroelectric facilities as well as their two existing nuclear reactors. There are major points of contention with India that I think need to be on the watch list. It doesn't always get as much attention as China does, but India is very disturbed by China's aggressiveness in the South China Sea in terms of its sovereignty claims, because India has very strong trading relationships with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and anything they think that could disrupt the sea lanes is of great importance. And remember, the Indians also have part of the Sakhalin LNG project, so that too is of concern to Indians. The Indians are also very concerned by what they see as aggressive measures by the Chinese Navy. They wonder why the Chinese submarine fleet has expanded so dramatically, basically underneath Hainan Island, and see this as a projection of power on into the Indian Ocean. If you remember looking at your map, India has a huge territory in the Nicobar and Andaman Islands, which are nearly 1,000 miles off the coast of India. So it's not exactly readily defensible by the Indian homeland strategic forces. And because this area looks like a very potentially promising area for offshore oil and gas development and is basically unpopulated except for some very traditional indigenous peoples, the Indian Navy in particularly can sometimes sound like they've gone gaga over the nature of the Chinese threat. The Chinese, also by the Indians and others in the region, are questioned as to why they're helping the Pakistanis build a deep water port at Gwadar along the Iranian frontier and very near the entrance to the Persian Gulf. While it might sound totally far-fetched and loony, the Chinese, when you talk to them, talk about using the port of Gwadar to link potential natural gas pipelines from Iran and even from Turkmenistan across Afghanistan, and a network that they would build from Gwadar, which road and rail, which they would build on up into Central Asia through some of the most inhospitable territory in the world. But the Chinese are doing this. The roads have begun construction. The gas pipeline is now at the Iranian-Pakistan frontier, despite U.S. sanctions. And the Chinese, if you talk to them directly, they will tell you they see this as part of a forward economic policy. The Chinese, of course, argue this is totally benign. It's simply them as an emerging power looking for strategic goods and services and markets they need. But when you sit in New Delhi, you hear a very different story from a number of Indian defense planners. So let me cut off there, kind of having set that stage, and we'll turn to the other panelists.
Sounds great. Thank you very much for that tour de force of the whole global scene. Steve.
Thanks a lot. Scott, thanks a lot for inviting me today. It's good to be at CNP. The remarks that I'd like to make, the thoughts that I have today, I think are super appropriate for this particular group, and what I hope that that you guys will be thinking about. So to sum up what Charlie said and what others said is a narrative that's been out there for some time, and it's that we're in a world of oil scarcity, of resource scarcity, in which we have on one hand a waning superpower, that's the United States, but that continues to have a prodigious appetite for fossil fuels, rare earth minerals, metals, and then a juggernaut rising, ascending at the same time, and that over the next 2 or 3 decades is going to its appetite is going to rise. It is rising and will continue to, and will account for most of the increase in global demand for oil in particular, but the demand for other resources too. And then if you play that out, how are the United States, the waning power, and then the rising power, China, going to divide up these resources? Who is going to make the main adjustment in that equation? And are you going to have friction? Are you going to have resource war? And what's interesting is how fast events move. So on the political side, one murder, a murder of one British businessman, a panicked Chinese policeman ending up in a regional, provincial U.S. consulate, and a blind dissident insisting on coming to the United States later, and the firm Chinese political edifice looks a little less firm, and a look at China's demographics and its economic challenges, and the narrative, the Chinese juggernaut looks like it's a little less of a fait accompli as we have been reading about until very, very recently. And alongside that narrative, around 9 months ago, another energy narrative came into the public sphere, and that's what I want to focus most of my remarks on. Let's put shale gas aside. That's another topic. Let's talk about oil. So the projection is that depending on who's making the estimate, the world demand for oil is going to grow from currently 89 million barrels a day to 105, or some say 125 million barrels a day by 2035. Most of that increase being accounted for by China. And again, where is that oil going to come from? And the United States still being a prodigious consumer of oil, who's going to give some up so that China can have its? What we have had over the last 9 months and starting in the fall is a lot of our energy experts, meaning American energy experts, trotting out a new narrative, and the experts started to count up shale oil in North Dakota and Texas, oil sands coming from Canada, new oil finds in deep water, the Gulf of New Mexico, already underway and growing efficiencies in the U.S. economy, tighter CAFE standards, growing use of biofuels, and adding all that up. And when you look 5 years out and then beyond that, the U.S. appetite for imports from distant lands shrinks a lot. And then looking further afield, big, gigantic oil finds in the equatorial margin, the area north of Brazil on the east coast of Latin America, deep water Brazil, across the South Atlantic, deep water Angola, on the other side in East Africa in Kenya. Gigantic oil finds over the last few months in all of these places, and projected large new oil volumes potentially in the Russian Arctic. And we see that this narrative that's projected for the United States is a potential global phenomenon. That if these experts are correct, that the narrative in which this China-U.S. framework, this conflict framework is placed, could be a different one, not of fossil fuel scarcity, but one of fossil fuel abundance. Let's just play that out. I happen to be what I write about on this topic is I sit on the fence and let these guys play out these, mainly because they don't trot out their data, and maybe Charlie got a hold of the data. I haven't seen it yet, but for argument's sake, let's play that out, because to the degree that it is accurate, it changes the conversation, the one we're having today about China. If that is accurate, then one, oil prices could drop. This tightness, if you have that abundance and then stasis in the rest of the projection, meaning the projections of oil production out of OPEC and the other petrostates in the world, Russia and elsewhere, then the global oil supply is larger than projected. Oil prices could drop, and that fight, that conflict between the United States and China for that limited volume of oil on the global market either decreases or vanishes. So where do you end up here? You end up instead of arguing how do we deal with a China, a Chinese voraciously hungry, resource poor China, how do we deal with that? To the United States and China have a different conversation. It's not a fight over resources. It's a world in which there are fossil fuels as far as the eye can see. and they are deciding between themselves what should public policy be in a world of energy abundance.
Thank you
I'll
very
leave it
much.
there.
That's great. I hope you're right. It cost me $70 to fill up the tank last week. So, Carter, your thoughts?
Thanks so much. I think I have a few ideas kind of related to what Charlie and Steve were saying. And actually, in Steve's first book, Oil and Glory, there's a narrative in there, or a section, where one of Charlie's colleagues at Brookings, Strobe Talbot, who was then senior official within the Clinton administration, is looking at the concept of a great game, which is in Central Asia in particular, this conflict between the great powers. And so there's a current narrative and debate within public policy and academic areas right now talking about the possibility of a new great game in Central Asia and in other areas between Russia, China, and the United States in terms of the development. And it actually follows in line with many of the things that Steve was talking about. And I think what's interesting about some of the points Charlie was making is, especially with the emergence of shale gas, this offers great new opportunities in terms of the possibility of switching more towards a framework of cooperation as opposed to this conflict. And I think, as Steve was saying, there were some, obviously price issues going to be a big part of this, but also relative demand, and also to the extent there's access to resource questions, that'll play a big, or be a big deciding factor as to how this all plays out. But I think one area where we could be helpful in terms of skewing things in a positive direction is by trying to continue to strengthen the cooperation between the United States and China on this. And I think we've already seen a lot of positive steps in this regard, primarily in the private sector, but also various government initiatives that have been aimed at trying to build those ties. And there are a number of companies, a number of the Chinese companies that have really been looking to build their insights in the shale gas field, by shale gas and shale oil, by partnering with a number of the both major oil producers here in the United States, but also some of the smaller independent players. One example is, one of the Chinese majors, one of their national oil companies, has been working with Devon Energy in Oklahoma, and they are a major. They were, through an acquisition that they did of Mitchell Energy, they became one of the leaders on the forefront of shale gas development. So I think there's a real desire to learn and understand these techniques, and there's a big debate right now as to how what that future potential is, and will the technical challenges from a geologic standpoint make China's development a lot more difficult than it is in the United States. But I think there are some great partnership opportunities. And so why do I bring this up? Well, I think if you look at sort of past history, we've sort of had ebbs and flows in terms of our relationship. And I think to the extent that from a policy perspective, we can help to continue building, taking more of a partnership approach as opposed to a more confrontational approach, that can be quite helpful. So one major example that some of you may remember was when CNOOC, the China National Offshore Oil Company, tried to make an acquisition of Unocal about 6 years ago. And there was a huge debate here in the United States, and especially in this town, as to whether or not that should go forward. Although the potential threat that could have been associated with that was very minimal, there was very much an overreaction, I think, and something which really was a sore spot for a while if you speak with people on both sides of that equation. So I think there are some great opportunities, and I think when the Vice President of China was here back in February, he talked, one of the main parts of his major foreign policy speech was talking about the concepts of mutual respect, equality, and mutual benefit. And I think there are a number of great opportunities for building on those same ideas in the energy sector, despite sort of broader consensus that there is a potential for a lot of conflict going forward. So I think you know, I'll leave it at that. I know we started late, but I'll you know, look forward to discussing in the conversation here.
Thank you, Carter. Let me just start off the discussion before we get to your questions out there with this. What does it look like when a Chinese state-owned enterprise, energy enterprise, is trying to get business in, country X? They're not hamstrung by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, let's say. And so what does that competition with a Western energy company look like? Do we have any firm examples from your experience? And also, are there instances where a U.S. and Chinese energy, or Western and Chinese energy companies are cooperating rather than getting the big access contracts? I'll just throw that out there to the panel.
I'll just throw out one more. I don't know about an example of cooperation, although that's there must be, and if there isn't, then there should be, because I mean, it's smart to get into a deal with the Chinese. But what happens, for example, in Africa, where there's a big hydrocarbon boom and new petrostates being minted by the month. It's led by infrastructure. So the willingness to throw up roads, buildings, hospitals, power, electricity before anything. And the other thing that one sees, and one saw this in the Turkmen case, where CNPC was competing with Exxon, has been there and really dug in, and Chevron both still hope to get something onshore. The U.S. and the West as a whole persist in wanting a gas deal before agreeing to build infrastructure to transport it, where the Turkmen are really, really worried about transporting it. And the Chinese agreed, before there was an onshore deal, to build that pipeline, and began to build that natural gas pipeline into China, and then got the sole foreign onshore natural gas deal.
Very good.
I think looking at Africa, and I'm not using the example of Nigeria, but it's been replicated many places. As Steve was saying, they not only come in and build other goodies, like the best thing to build in Africa is a soccer stadium, win everybody's hearts and minds, but they do it with low-cost financing from the Chinese government. So it's not just a question of doing it, but actively having their government behind them in these activities. And in terms of cooperation, we now have some Chinese companies as partners in the oil sands in Canada. You have Chinese companies involved in there. You have Chinese companies involved in shale gas development in Texas. So they're coming along, and they're learning and trying, as he was saying, with the Devon energy situation. They see this is how they get the technology.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Questions and comments from our audience here. And don't be shy. Yes, sir, if you could identify yourself.
Hi, Patrick Sharp from the State Department. Given the Chinese increasing demand for oil, and if you buy into the narrative of decreasing U.S. dependence on foreign oil, imported oil, what does this mean for, given the thing you pointed about the hue and cry in Washington over the proposed Chinese acquisition of Unitas a few years ago, when we think about the Middle East and the amount that we invest in maintaining the security of oil flow to the U.S. from the Middle East, where does this go 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Is China going to have a big navy? Are they going to replace us over there? Is it in our interest to stop spending our money to defend, to protect those lines of importation to the U.S. from the Middle East and turn that over to the Chinese? I mean, I imagine that would cause for the military a huge, a lot of concern back here. But is that something where we look for some sort of a strategic partnership or something like that? Where does that go?
So just a small question from you, which is about the nature of geopolitics. And it struck me, I was in Qatar at a conference some years ago, and I thought to myself, well, the implicit bargain has been for about 50 years. We have access to energy in the Middle East, and we provide a market and security. Well, who is it now that has the biggest market for energy, and who might become able to provide security and don't bust you about human rights issues too often? So, thoughts?
We actually had a conference on this exact topic at our Brookings Doha Center back in late February. And we had people from Japan across the whole Indian Ocean littoral. And the central theme was exactly your question. And I think it's overwhelmingly clear that the U.S. and to a significant extent Western Europe, if you go a little beyond your time horizon, maybe 15 to 20 years, will basically probably import very little oil from the Middle East. And that the huge shift is to Asian markets. Now, I would argue that that portends a tremendous strategic shift. I mean, obviously, the United States will probably continue strategic interests vis-a-vis Israel in the Middle East, I would imagine. And undoubtedly, when some of our allies in Asia are heavily dependent on Gulf oil, we certainly won't want to see Gulf oil threatened. But I think it will portend much more active Chinese and Indian naval presence throughout the whole Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf. Because, you know, India, while behind China in terms of the amount of oil they consumed, will in the not too distant future surpass China in total population. And some people believe that if India reaches a certain GDP threshold, which economic development literature says at about $2,000 GDP, you take off. That's what the Chinese did. Now, whether it will be the same, but it may well portend that India becomes far more dependent than some of the current numbers that kind of just assume a steady state on up would assume. So India and China will be the dominant powers, I believe, in that part of the world.
Yes,
Yeah,
Steve?
I have a thought on that. Done some exploration of that for the reasons that the questioner stated, and I get some of the results that Charlie laid out, and the equation goes like this. So the United States itself, no longer the Carter Doctrine of protecting the Persian Gulf oil, disappears, vanishes, but it shifts from protection of Persian Gulf to we're still partners with Israel, and so our Navy stays out there, but for that reason, and then the other part of the naval footprint abroad is the securing of global commerce, the sea lanes. And so the question I asked, does the United States maintain its naval footprint? And what I got back is yes, that the United States retains its role, its desired role, going back to Teddy Roosevelt, of having a projection, a naval projection all the way around the world. And its partners, its global partners, for the reasons that Charlie stated. They need oil from the Persian Gulf, but also just the movement of stuff around. So the United States will have the urge to maintain that naval footprint. But the conflict that then comes into play is, what about the U.S. public? So the U.S. public realizes, hey, we're not over there. We're in this era when our budgets are so tight, we're having to cut back. Should we be spending as much money as we are spending to pay for all that? Shouldn't our partners be throwing in and contributing? And so what I got back in answer to that question was that there will be a demand, a voter demand, a constituency demand in Washington to demand financial contributions abroad more financial contributions to support the Navy, and then force demands from countries like India, but not China, that there would be big pushback, discomfort in allowing, in standing aside for a Chinese blue water naval force in the Persian Gulf outside the South China Sea.
Thank you. Carter, you had a...
I think that actually ties back to the point about, the mutual respect and mutual benefit approach. And there was actually Steve's organization, New America Foundation, did a presentation on this where someone from PFC Energy was there last year. And, in his presentation, he rank orders what's China's preference in terms of where to invest in the energy sector worldwide. And obviously number one was at home in the domestic market, then Asia, then Africa, where it's quite comfortable, as Charlie was saying. Then you get down to Central Asia and Russia. Bottom of the list was Middle East. And what's the reason for that? They look at the experience of the United States and just do not want to take the same caretaker status. It's actually very interesting in talking with people about this in Beijing. When we talk about various investment opportunities worldwide, interesting comparison that they make between, and it sort of ties back to my previous point on the CNOOC deal. They talk about the difference of dealing in the United States versus Canada, where obviously a lot has been done. And the point that they make is, you have a lot of the same positive macroeconomic environments and your regulatory framework on the one hand, but without the quote-unquote political risk. And I thought that was kind of an interesting observation, because typically when you think political risk, you're talking about a sort of a frontier market. But I think there is that observation as well. So it's pretty interesting.
Very good.
Question?
Yes, let's see, a lot of questions indeed. Right here, sir.
Sort of a bifurcated question. The first is, could you all address what do you think the role of OPEC will become in this brave new world? That is, if you were advising, if OPEC were united and you were advising its staff, how would you suggest that the existing OPEC powers play this? And the other is, it seems like Sudan is kind of a microcosm for all of this happening very quickly. What do you see happening there in between South Sudan, and the Chinese investments in the north?
So whatever you do, please don't give good advice to OPEC, okay? But go ahead.
I think OPEC will, in 10 years' time, be fundamentally irrelevant to the world market. There will basically be 3 countries that count in terms of what they do, and that will be Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Unless you believe there's going to be a transformation politically in Iran, which I think there'll probably be someday, and Iraq really can be on the upper range of what people have projected. By that I mean a 10 million barrel a day producer, not a 5 or 6 million barrel a day producer. It will be very difficult for them to control the market. U.S. gasoline demand, which is of course our greatest vulnerability, has basically probably peaked. Will probably never be higher. It was alluded to by Steve when the President's Cafe standards go through. After a decade, we'll knock off another close to 2 million barrels a day of oil demand, and with all the new supplies coming on that he highlighted, Europe is continuing massive advances in reducing their dependency in the transportation sector. So outside Asia, which is a huge demand in the transportation sector, I don't see that OPEC's going to have a lot of clout. They're going to, in the long run, get killed by technology. They're going to get killed ultimately. OPEC's going to get killed by the electric car. 20 years from now, not today, not tomorrow, but the electric car is inexorably coming. It'll take a long time before it meaningfully dents the market. but we'll probably see, I believe in 20 years, we'll see hydrogen fuel cells and a whole host of technologies that will make the traditional demand for oil, particularly in something so visible as the transportation sector vulnerability, disappear.
I just wanted to throw in one that why this scenario is uncertain, why one has to play one's cards cautiously on this. Until last week, Repsol, the Spanish oil company, was expecting to hit a big oil field offshore Cuba, 6 billion barrels in a region called the North Belt Thrust, and last Friday announced dry hole. So these are projections, these are scenarios being played out. OPEC produces 30 million barrels a day. That's still a lot of oil. It's a concentrated volume. Let's not forget Venezuela is a leading member of OPEC too. So to the degree that the conventional scenario is correct, I think OPEC is still very influential. To the degree the abundance scenario is correct, it's marginalized.
But do you see it as being irrelevant in 20 years?
I think Charlie's saying starting in 20 years, right? So my answer is no.
I think the one thing that does change is this, the preface to your question was, if you can get everyone to work together within OPEC, and I think a lot of the trends and the new technologies that we were talking about is going to make that increasingly challenging. So,
just an anecdote, which I think is always interesting to remind people, both the North Sea, the giant Ekofisk field, and the field that struck Prudhoe Bay, the industry had given up. They had drilled, not found a thing, but under their contracts, they had to in each location drill one more field, and those were the two that hit the big ones.
Yes, further question. We have to move it around a little bit because we've got a lot of folks.
Oh, Sudan.
Right in the back here.
Yeah, my name is Brian Fishman. I'm with the New American Foundation.
Brian?
The question that I have for you is the impact of Chinese oil exploration or attempts to extract oil from various places around the world on their sort of general approach to foreign policy, viewing various countries as sort of black boxes, not dealing with human rights concerns and these sorts of issues. One of the lessons over the last 15 years is that populations in small groups, whether they're terrorist organizations or the movements we see in the Arab Spring, these sub-state actors have decided that they are important players in those places. If the Chinese are going to engage in these places, are they going to have to, at some point, engage these sub-state actors?
Is the Chinese diplomatic corps ready to broaden its field of interactions?
I'll just start out. My own observation is that Sudan, this gentleman raised the issue of Sudan. This is a wake-up call to China that you can't play only one side of the table, and you do have to be aware of what's going on in the underbrush. I think you're right. That the history is showing, and recent history shows, that you can't just go in cold-bloodedly with a bad regime, make your payoffs in investments that are supposed to last 30 and 40 years. You have to be smarter, and if China keeps doing that, it's going to backfire. It risks backfiring in a bunch of places.
Carter.
I think the one sort of caveat to bear in mind is the various challenges that might come up in terms of maintaining that balance. And I think very often we in the United States have quite a proactive approach in this regard. And I think to a certain extent the new dynamics will also affect our approach, and may potentially require a little bit of a stepping back as well, just in terms of the best way to affect things. And I think over time that you can there are a lot of other ways of kind of dealing with this more directly, and so that may or may not be the most effective as a policy approach.
I would just add, keep in mind, because it gets so much play, these Chinese steels, but they're still in total just about 1 million barrels a day out of an 89 million barrel a day oil market. So while not insignificant, they aren't as dramatic as sometimes the press would lead you to believe.
Interesting. Yes, sir.
I'm Pat Malloy. I was on the U.S.-China Commission for a number of years. I teach now at Catholic U Law School, both public and international trade. The Law of the Sea Convention, which we consider now customary international law, we have not ratified it. And it has provisions dealing with the exploitation in the exclusive economic zone of both living and non-living resource, which gets into oil. The United States, the State Department has now sent up a message to the Hill that they want to try to get the Congress, the Senate, to ratify the Law of the Sea Convention. I think it's probably the strength in our hand, but I would love to get the opinion of each of you on whether that's a wise move for the United States to ratify that convention, and if so, why it would help us dealing with these energy issues.
I'm passing.
Okay.
Yeah.
I frankly, I looked at it when I was in the Navy, but I have not, it hasn't come up in terms of, direct applicability. Is there an energy context which you have in mind?
Well, the exclusive economic zone,
yeah.
which is from the territorial sea out to 200 miles, sometimes beyond, depending on the continental shelf, that's all oil. I mean, if you're going to exploit those oil resources, and there are a lot of conflicts over how to determine those exclusive economic zones in Asia, which is a big issue.
I have never seen any reason, despite a handful of U.S. senators who have opposed it simply on the basis that they don't think there should be any criteria denying U.S. access to anything, that we shouldn't ratify the Law of the Sea Treaty. And I commend you, if you didn't see it just today, Senator Lugar has a very fine speech that he just gave yesterday on why we should ratify the law of the Sea Treaty. As you say, we recognize it as customary international law, so for all intents and purposes we abide by it. But if anything, it's hurting the United States in our ongoing boundary delimitations in the high north of Alaska. Because as you say, other countries can rush forward and put forth their claims to UNCLOS for recognition of their continental shelves. And the United States is fast getting to the point where if we don't put in a claim, we're going to miss the window called for in the UNCLOS agreement to have our continental shelf recognized by other nations in the world.
Very good. Yes. Yes, sir.
Yes. Thank you, Scott. It's Dana Marshall. I had actually maybe a couple of questions for the panel, if possible. One is to try to connect a couple of these things together. As a way to try to balance our trade with China, how would you discuss the sort of the policy and the commercial and the economic implications of possibly liquefying our shale gas and sending it there? Or might it be better to beneficiate it further here, get more jobs here, and send it there? That's sort of one question. The other one is, I would love to think that we could stop spending all the money policing sea lanes to make sure that other countries get oil. But I was a little bit surprised from this panel that there was no one that made the point that oil being fungible, if something were to happen, of course it's going to affect somebody in Iowa, even if he's getting all of his oil from Canada. I mean, there's still going to be a major impact. There may be more of a reason, Steve, than just because of being friendly with Israel that we'll continue to want to have an interest there. And I wonder if the panel might speak a little to that.
Okay.
Well, on the first issue, on the gas, let me take that because we just 3 weeks ago released a report that's been in the works for a year with a study group we put together looking at the whole LNG export issue, what it would do to domestic feedstock prices for major manufacturing. First of all, I don't think there's any way to target our LNG exports as to where they go. There's a For those of you unfamiliar, just a few years ago, we thought we were going to be importing 40% of our gas in the not too distant future, and now with shale gas, we will not be doing that. And all the 8 companies that built facilities to import gas now have expressed varying degrees of interest to convert them to exporting gas. In the course of our study, we basically argued, and we looked at all the reports that have been done, that we could convert all those export facilities, those import facilities to exports without having a dramatic, hardly negligible impact on domestic natural gas prices. The impact was somewhere around 22 cents an MCF with exports. So we believe that there is more than enough gas to revitalize U.S. manufacturing, and I really, in my own personal opinion, think we are missing the boat. This is an opportunity to reindustrialize America if we don't blow it. There's enough gas out there for, at a minimum, 50 and probably more like 100 years, particularly if we include the Canadian excess gas that they have as well. So it's a win-win. It's a win-win for everybody. There is a process by which those companies can become export facilities, dealing with both DOE and FERC and the Coast Guard. We argue that should go through that process. The big constraint actually is not the technical conversion, but it's the financing. Because even to retrofit one of these plants, you're talking about $1 billion to $2 billion. And unlike oil, which is indeed fungible, as you say, you get it to Tidewater, you can send it anywhere. The nature of the LNG market is to get financing, you're probably going to have 80 or 85% of your offtake already contracted for by somebody. And so we think it's going to be most difficult for the companies that don't get in the queue quickly, because after 2020, when we look at the world gas market, we see an awful lot of gas coming out of Australia. By that time, Mozambique's emerging as a giant player down the road in world gas, and a whole host of other places, not to mention the uncertainty of shale gas in China and how that will affect. So we think it's a great opportunity and that there's not a mix. Your point on oil prices, I would agree wholeheartedly. If the price goes up anywhere in the world because of a disruption, even if we have all our own oil, we will pay that higher price because markets will respond. But I think most of you know that in the earlier oil, those of you old enough to remember the 73, 74, 79 oil shocks, we now know from numerous studies those were not done, did not occur because of any serious physical disruption in the supply of oil on the East Coast. It was all because of federal allocation and price controls that distorted markets. You could have gone out to Potomac when gasoline lines were endemic in Washington, driven up to a station and filled up.
I think actually the other variable on the LNG front is obviously what we end up doing on transportation here in the United States in terms of CNG, LNG vehicles. In terms of that price impact as well, I fully agree. And I was actually in Dubai about a month ago, and there was a big discussion and a debate in terms of what would be the impact of Iran, if there was some military intervention this year. And I think huge consensus both amongst U.S. Analysts as well as people from the region is that everyone realizes that even though there's tough talk in this town, everyone is doing everything possible behind the scenes to kind of avoid that, and a lot of it actually comes back exactly to what you're referring to. So the $200 oil on early November is not going to be a good political scenario for many people.
Thank you, Dana. Yes.
I'm Greg Achtandilian. I'm a senior fellow here on the Middle East for CNP. I just wanted to talk about the security of the Persian Gulf issue, because this came up, and people were talking about maybe China replacing the U.S. to guard the sea lanes of oil coming out of the Gulf. But our military posture is more than that. In other words, we're also there to protect the countries of the area. And it's hard for me to see those countries then turning to China for their protection. In other words, at the end of the day, if push comes to shove, they want the U.S. as the ultimate protector. We saw this in the first Gulf War very readily. And it goes even beyond oil. It goes to terrorism in that area, a lot of strategic issues outside of oil. So I just wanted to throw that out there in terms of if we're looking down the road, who's going to replace who in the Gulf. I just think there's a cautionary note here. Thank you.
Interesting. Thank you, Greg. Yes, in the back.
Very quick question. So sort of the hottest issue that's happening in China right now is Xi and all of the corruption scandal that's sort of engulfed him and many other top leaders. Particularly going back to the issue of shale gas and how the natural gas market in China is going to be the next for growth in the next 5 to 10 years, with a lot of American firms and foreign firms seeking to partner and operate in China's natural gas markets, upstream, downstream, midstream, all. In your interactions with the different companies and with the U.S. government agencies and regulations who are involved in developing this Trans-Pacific Partnership, have there been efforts to develop a industry best practices for dealing with corruption issues? So it's something that I feel like has not been talked about enough, with extremely sort of high oversight of FCPA oversight now that's growing in this country. A lot of our oil and gas companies who are seeking to get into shale gas in China are going to face the issue of dealing with the corruption that comes from their local partner. Energy resources in China tend to be traded like little horse races. The company basically permits to explore for shale gas will be probably not the cleanest partners. So from just your experience with the industry, could you tell us a little bit more about if there's any movement at all amongst the companies or with the U.S. government to address that issue?
I can throw out one is that there's the FCPA, and then there's the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is active around the world, and a lot of companies and countries, I think 49 countries. I'm not sure China. I don't think it is. In fact, I know it's not. It's not signatory to it. The U.S. became the first among the so U.S., Russia, and China became the first one to sign on to it recently. But this is besides the point. You know, first it's not clear who initiates the bribe. Is it the payer or the payee? So there's a lot of competition among the companies themselves to get that deal. They know they need to get that deal, and so where does the idea of that bribe come in? And then the other thing that I wanted to throw out there is China's timeline. China's timeline for gas, it could have a lot of gas, conventional and shale gas, but it's not clear. It's also not clear, even if it has it, if it's extractable, and if it's extractable at the scale that the United States has. And that timeline it's not 5 or 10 years. What I'm hearing is that the answers to the questions I just raised are like 2025 and after that.
Go ahead.
I think it actually ties back to my point from the Vice President's speech and something, a saying which is constantly used about the mutual respect. I think, you know, it's important to bring these points up and to make sure that they continue to take steps towards, you know, making these reforms. But I think a lot of this can be done by, you know, having the direct access in terms of our relationships and kind of leadership by example, as opposed to constantly wagging our fingers at these practices. So I think a lot of it is more how you make the statement and how you continue to kind of bring people in the right direction. I think, you know, the fact that so many of these companies are publicly traded, you know, there is a discount in terms of, you know, their market valuation if, you know, they have this taint to them. So I think over time, you know, that impact can be quite positive. But I think constantly, you know, having it's good to have it as an issue, but having it as too much of an issue in sort of a public format in terms of being, you know, talking down upon someone, I think it has its downsides and its danger. So
I am certainly not by any stretch of the imagination a specialist on internal Chinese politics. But listening to my colleagues at Brookings who are, I am struck by how few people even raise on the outside possibility of China becoming unstable. And I look at the scandals you referred to, the reports of literally thousands of demonstrations throughout the country for expropriations of people's lands without compensation, all kinds of things the average citizen seems to be enduring at the hands of the Communist Party. And I just, it may begin with a hard economic landing because we see growth falling off. And it's debatable, of course, how fast that's, but I could see a situation with a hard economic landing and continuing descent as we go into the Chinese elections, that China as an investment climate could get a little wobbly. And I think it's a scenario that we shouldn't discount, but I don't see anybody even giving that a 10% chance of probability. It's dangerous.
We have time for about one more question. Yes, sir.
My question goes to the Erin. What's the main obstacle for the Senate to ratify the UNCLOS?
The main obstacle is really just a handful of senators that keep it from coming to a vote because of very conservative people who just see it as anything that restricts any possibility for our Navy to move when and where they want to are opposed to it. It really is a relatively handful of people who keep it from coming to a vote. If it came to a vote, I'm convinced it would pass.
Charles, you should understand, these are members of the Republican Party who are blocking.
Well, I was being more diplomatic.
No, but there's a very good article in the National Journal Daily today on this very issue, identifying the key people who are blocking. Senator Kerry wants to bring it up. It has passed out of the Foreign Relations Committee a couple times, but there have always been some Republicans on the floor. If you can press it to a vote, I think you can get the vote. You need 66 to get it passed.
Thank you.
That's a former Senate staffer speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel for this excellent discussion. And I should mention that on June 4th, CNP will be issuing a major report on energy infrastructure, so look to our website for that. Thank you for coming.